Greetings, it is time for our monthly inflation update, and as always, we go to my free parameter matrix, which is the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, and the 10-year US Treasury yield. And the reason that this has three different parameters is so as to create a diversified set of parameters by which to judge structural inflation. To the extent possible, we want to measure it on a worldwide basis and to use freely traded metrics so that you get past all of these accusations that the official inflation statistics are rigged and so forth. They're not rigged, and a lot of people are desperate to overstate the extent of inflation and therefore want to say that inflation metrics are rigged. So we use something like this middle indicator, the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, which is both worldwide and comprises of freely traded commodities, and therefore is not rigged at all. It's impossible for this to be rigged. And I need all three of these to be above 3% before I say that inflation is structurally high, okay? One of these being above 3% while the other two are not, is not what is going to comprise structurally high inflation. And as we'll see in the second part of this video, many people are so desperate to overstate inflation that they will go to quite humorous and absurd extremes, tossing any mathematical skill or basic numeracy out the window, and it's quite funny when they do that. But for the beginning, let's go through these three parameters, starting with the 10-year US Treasury yield. 10-year US Treasury yield, it has been above 3% for a couple of years now, but it's stuck at this 4.18% level. This is more an indicator of future inflation rather than a measurement of past inflation. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the 10-year annual growth rate is 1.06%. Now, many people who are desperate to get to a situation where they can crow about inflation being high finally want this commodity measurement to be in inflation, because for the longest time it was in deflation, because the plunge in oil prices from the oil supply increase due to hydraulic fracturing in the United States, which took the oil price down by half from $100 a barrel to $50 a barrel, is now slipping outside of this 10-year window. It is more than 10 years ago, and therefore this index will start to become positive, but we'll deal with that as it comes. The reason the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index is the most important is, as I said earlier, it comprises of freely traded commodities, oil, natural gas, coal, gold, silver, everything like that. It is worldwide in nature. That is absurd because if that were the case, the price of all commodities would be rising when measured in dollars. And that is not the case. In fact, oil is cheaper than it was at the time of its all-time high, which was in 2008. It is still, in fact, down about half from that all-time high, even so many years later. It has become more expensive for the customer, but that is simultaneous with the wage increase of the service provider. So an increase in service prices is inseparable from wage increases as well, where they're quite willing to be hypocritical to the extent that whenever anything they buy rises in price, that is inflation, but whenever they get a salary increase or they make money of any sort, somehow that is not inflation. So they're very selective about counting what is inflation and what isn't. And that's why these commodity prices are the purest metric, whereas service price inflation is far more ambiguous for those reasons. Now we go to the US CPI. In most months, I walk everyone through that BLS.gov reading of the US CPI. That link is in the description box below. I don't want to go through that in total detail this month. For the methodology, you can refer to prior months, but suffice it to say, this is the data from the BLS.gov website of the US CPI. And the way to look at it in this table, which is more simplified and informative, is the 1 month inflation rate, how that annualizes to. So 1 month to the 12th power is the annual CPI. The 2 month inflation rate to the 6th power is the annual CPI. Similarly, 3 months to the 4th power, 6 months squared, and so forth. And then just for added information, I have the CPI since January 1st, 2001, so the entirety of the 21st century. To date, 80% CPI inflation over that time, but that is only 2.5% a year. So the big spike in inflation that lasted for a short while, late 2021, early 2022, has dissipated out of even the 2-year window and exists only in the 3-year and larger windows. And that's why these two numbers are a little bit high, because of that brief spike that rose quickly and went away just as quickly. And that is still not enough to boost the 10-year inflation rate over 3%. It's still at 2.9%. Many people like to claim that only the 1-year inflation rate is the one to look at, but they only say that when it's high and the data fits their need to overstate inflation so they can feel like a victim. In reality, that is too short of a window to measure the structural inflation rate, because right now, the 1-year inflation rate is just 2.6%, and it's been low for 2 years, and I could just cite that to refute all of these unsophisticated people coming forth with their claims of high inflation. So no, inflation is not high. So we go back to my matrix. So we saw all three: the 10-year compounding annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compounding annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, and the 10-year US Treasury yield. And today, November 30, 2024, the numbers are 2.9% for the US CPI, still below 3%, but not above it. And remember, 3% is the optimal inflation. Inflation too low causes too much sluggishness in financial markets and in innovation. So even if it went to 3.1, 3.2, that is only slightly above optimal. 3% is optimal. It's not some red alert type of limit. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index plus 1.06%, far below 3%. And the 10-year US Treasury yield, this is the only one that is above 3%. So only one of these measurements is above 3%. The other two are not. So no, inflation is not structurally high. I don't care what anyone says. The people who like to assert that inflation is high do not take a rigorous data-backed measurement to form their conclusions. They go on anecdote. And some of the anecdotes are quite ridiculous. And we will look at some of those in this next section of our video. For example, see this video over here, the January 2024 video. The first comment here by someone named Daniel Lee. In order to refute the video, he could not refute any of the data, any of the methodology, any concept of index-based investing or anything like that. Nothing at all. All of that is totally beyond his intellectual capacity. His only rebuttal was the McChicken costs $3. Used to be $1, you are a liar. Now, of all the things you can use to judge whether inflation is high, taking one food item, something that is a heavily processed food that is branded by a fast food outlet that has tons of unhealthy chemicals in it. I have explained at length elsewhere on this channel why whole foods that you would cook at home rise in price much, much, much more slowly than processed foods, because processed foods and junk foods have to support the salaries of food scientists and chemical companies and marketing directors and ad agencies and DEI diversity directors and so forth. And that's what you're paying for. Whereas you don't have to pay for that if you just buy broccoli or carrots or arugula or something like that. Not to mention that he doesn't give a time frame. He says it costs $3, used to be $1. How long ago? 15 years ago? 20 years ago? What is the annualized inflation rate, even if you're foolish enough to eat junk food so often that this is how you measure inflation? If it went from $1 to $3 in 15 years, then that's a tripling in 15 years. That's not a very high percentage annual growth rate, although you would necessarily expect it to be higher than something you would cook at home. So I give my usual response. Study Kartik's law of inflation, which you can also see in this tag in the upper right-hand corner, because these people think that one cherry-picked anecdote is a rebuttal to all types of data and logic, and the anecdote they use is always some super unhealthy processed junk food. Some junk food with artificial flavors that they buy rises in price, and that makes them lose their mind because they're effectively drug addicts tied to this type of thing. McChicken. Did his great-great-grandparents eat a McChicken every day? No. But this is how the average person is far, far, far below the level of basic arithmetic skills and logic needed to evaluate inflation correctly. Now we'll go to another example. Here is another very obnoxious person who is desperate to overstate inflation. So I made this video some time ago about how Nouriel Roubini is wrong about how QE caused inflation. You can see that video on this channel. So his rebuttal is, so a can of Coke costs way more than 1980 because 1980, that was 44 years ago. And why is he using a can of Coca-Cola that is high fructose corn syrup? That is the worst type of sugar you can possibly consume. If you want to get cancer or diabetes, one of the very good ways of doing that is to consume all these sugary carbonated beverages such as Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and so forth. And on this channel, I explain how money printing does not cause inflation and all the data supports that. But his whole argument is a can of Coke costs way more than 1980. Maybe that's God's way of telling you that you should not be consuming high fructose corn syrup. But whatever, this is what these people consider to be a rebuttal to actual data. And I've made fun of them many times and will continue to do so. He says food prices are 40% higher than 2019 because, first of all, that's not true at all. As we can see from the CPI index, it is not that much unless you're eating processed junk food every day, because that has to support the salaries of food lobbyists, marketing directors, ad agencies, food scientists, all kinds of lawyers and such, which broccoli and carrots do not have to support necessarily. But these people just have no capacity for any mathematical measurement, and they're just desperate to feel like they are victims. Inflation is to conservatives what global warming is to leftists, something very imaginary that they believe is an imminent crisis. The situations are exactly identical. But I find it striking that they always use some super unhealthy processed food as the centerpiece of their argument about inflation, because they're drug addicts, as I said before. Something that they consume that has artificial flavors in it, which Coca-Cola certainly does, is something they're addicted to, so when the price of their drug rises, they lose their mind and lose any capacity for rational thought. If you're consuming so much Coca-Cola that a can of Coke cost more than 44 years ago, how has he managed to even live 44 years past 1980? And that is why people who are worried about inflation really should be worried about inflammation. That connection may seem funny, but there's more to it than that, because all of these people desperate to overstate inflation so they can feel like a victim invariably use processed junk food as the centerpiece of their argument. Very anecdotal, and usually the most unhealthy thing one can think of. We saw Coca-Cola and some McDonald's McChicken sandwich. This is the extent of their rebuttal. That's why I don't care what anyone says. Inflation is not high, because the people who claim that it is high seem to not have even a fourth grade level of mathematical ability. That is a fact. So not to belabor that point too much, at least until next month, but this is the type of zeitgeist we live in when a bunch of very low intelligence people like to state that inflation is high, and it sells. Remember, fear sells. And perhaps I should do a parody video series that just overstates inflation, and many of those videos might go viral because it is easy to invent anecdotes that these people will take and run with. Maybe that's an idea worth pursuing. Anyway, this was my inflation update for this month. And if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. And thank you very much for watching.